The morning of August 15th, 1940, tasted of exhaust fumes and stale fear, not the raw, screaming terror of a deep dive, or the sudden, sickening lurch of a stall, but the quiet, creeping dread that had become as much a part of my uniform as the faded gray fabric itself. It clung to the back of my throat, a metallic tang that no amount of strong black coffee could wash away. This was our Adlertag, our Eagle Day, the grand offensive that was meant to shatter the Royal Air Force and pave the way for Operation Sea Lion. A day of monumental expectation, a day that felt less like a beginning and more like an endless, grinding continuation of the past weeks. My name is Erich Richter. I was 21, a lieutenant in Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen, Staffel 8. My Messerschmitt Bf 109E4, with the black chevron of my Staffelkapitän and my own red 1 on its side, was parked, gleaming faintly under the low gray sky, on the grass airfield near Teville, a small patch of French countryside now scarred by tire tracks and the constant roar of engines. It was 0700, and the air was already thick with the pungent, oily smell of aviation fuel, high-octane B4, a scent that once promised adventure, but now reeked of duty and impending death. Mixed with it was the damp, earthy smell of the morning dew rising from the grass, and the faint, unsettling aroma of burnt toast from the field kitchen, a breakfast I couldn't stomach. The ground was cold and slightly damp beneath my worn leather flying boots, the short blades of grass stiff and rough against the soles. My uniform, though freshly laundered, felt stiff and scratchy, a second skin of responsibility. My leather flying helmet, soft with age and the impress of countless flights, sat heavy in my gloved hand. The leather was cool and smooth, but the sheepskin lining was already beginning to feel prickly against my skin, anticipating the sweat of the cockpit. Around me, the airfield buzzed with a low, anxious energy. Mechanics, their faces smudged with grease and exhaustion, moved with practiced efficiency around the waiting aircraft. The clatter of tools, the sharp metallic clang of a wrench hitting tarmac, the low murmur of their voices, all blended into a nervous symphony. Over it all, the distant, intermittent cough of an engine sparking to life, then settling into a deep, guttural thrum, sent a shiver down my spine. The air vibrated with the promise of power, a power I was supposed to wield. I walked slowly towards my 109, the most beautiful and terrifying machine I knew. Its sleek, predatory lines, the sharp angles of its wings, the menacing glint of the machine guns visible in the propeller hub and wing roots, 2 MG-17s and 2 MG-FF-M cannons, filled me with a familiar mix of awe and apprehension. My hands, encased in soft leather gloves, felt clammy, a fine tremor running through them. I gripped the strap of my helmet tighter. The cockpit, that cramped metal womb. It was my world for hours, a coffin or a chariot, depending on the whims of fate. I remembered the first time I'd climbed into a 109, back at the training school in Zerbst. The exhilarating scent of new leather, fresh paint, and raw power. Now, it smelled of stale sweat, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, lingering odor of fear. My fear. And the fear of those who had flown before me, whose spirits seemed to cling to the metal. The canopy, when closed, would seal me into a world of my own, a world of dials and gauges, of the rhythmic throb of the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, and the terrifying expanse of the sky. My ground crew chief, old Karl Heinz, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with oil, stood by my plane, giving the propeller one last, ritualistic inspection. His face was lined with worry. His eyes, when he met mine, held a silent question I couldn't answer. "Morning, Lieutenant," he rumbled, his voice thick with the dialect of the Rhineland. The metal of the propeller blade felt smooth and cold beneath his gloved fingers. "Morning, Karl Heinz," I replied, my voice sounding thin, even to myself. "She ready to bite today?" He offered a weak smile. "Always ready, Lieutenant, always ready. Just wish you wouldn't push her so hard." He ran a hand over the fuselage, his touch almost a caress, feeling the cool, smooth metal. I ran my own hand along the dull green camouflage of the fuselage, feeling the slight roughness of the paint, the cold, unyielding metal beneath. It was both a weapon and a fragile shield. I thought of my sister, Greta, back in Dusseldorf, her letters filled with forced cheer, asking when I might be home. I could almost hear Moody's stern but loving voice, reminding me to eat my sauerkraut. The memories were a sharp, painful contrast to the reality of the airfield. They were a warmth I craved, a softness that was utterly absent here. A shrill whistle cut through the air, sharp and piercing. It was the signal. Briefing. My stomach clenched tighter. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified. I took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling my lungs. But it brought no comfort, just the taste of gasoline and anxiety. I nodded to Karl Heinz, a silent farewell before the fight, and made my way towards the small, hastily erected hut that served as our briefing room. The rough, wooden planks of its walls were still damp with morning dew. Each step felt heavy, a drag against the damp grass. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the restless energy of dozens of young men. The map, sprawling across the table, was a stark, almost beautiful tapestry of coastlines and air routes, marked with grease pencil and a chillingly precise understanding of our objectives. We were heading for the Thames estuary, targeting RAF airfields in Kent and Essex, pushing further inland than ever before. The numbers of bombers were staggering, over 1,000 aircraft in the air, a mass formation meant to overwhelm. Our job, the Jaeger, was to clear the path, to swat aside the Spitfires and Hurricanes, the Tommies, as we called them, before they could touch the bombers. It was a simple mission, in theory. In practice, it was a dance with death at 20,000 feet. The room was colder than the outside air, a damp chill seeping from the ground. I could feel the clammy sweat on my palms, even through my gloves. My eyes scanned the faces around me, young men, some barely out of school, their expressions a mixture of bravado and thinly veiled apprehension. Some laughed too loudly, others were unnaturally quiet, polishing their boots or meticulously checking their equipment. It was the calm before the storm, a fragile peace before the true monster of the sky was unleashed. The smell of cheap tobacco and stale coffee hung heavy in the air, mixing with the underlying scent of fear. My breath was shallow and quick. I felt the cold, hard wood of the bench against my thighs as I sat, bracing myself for the words that would send us all into the gray, unforgiving vastness above. The briefing was a blur of clipped commands and technical data, delivered by Major Kessler, our Gruppenkommandeur, a man whose face was etched with a permanent scowl and whose eyes held the weariness of too many battles. He pointed with a long wooden stick at the sprawling map, tracing our intended route over the channel, the blue expanse that now felt less like water and more like a vast, watery grave. The objectives, RAF Hawken, then pushing inland towards RAF Biggin Hill, a key fighter base. Our Geschwader would provide top cover for the Dornier Do-17 and Heinkel HE-111 bombers. The numbers were staggering, almost an entire Luftwaffe unleashed. Over 1,400 sorties were planned for the day, a colossal hammer blow. The air in the hut grew heavier, thick with cigarette smoke and the unspoken tension that clung to every man. The smell of cheap tobacco mixed with the faint, almost metallic tang of Major Kessler's pomade. The cold, damp wood of the bench beneath me felt hard and unforgiving, mirroring the resolve I tried to project. My hands, still clammy inside my gloves, picked nervously at a loose thread on my sleeve. "Remember your formations, gentlemen!" Kessler's voice, gravelly and devoid of emotion, cut through the murmurs. "The enemy will be airborne in force. Stick to your swarm, protect your leader, cover your wingmen. This is not a glorious charge. This is a systematic destruction." He looked at each of us, his gaze cold and assessing, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the younger pilots, the ones whose faces still held a hint of boyish hope. A profound chill settled in the room, colder than the damp morning air, a chill born of grim reality. The silence that followed his words was punctuated only by the distant, almost ceaseless rumble of engines starting up outside, a symphony of raw, unleashed power. The ground vibrated faintly, a low thrumming that went straight to my gut. The taste of stale coffee and fear was a bitter coating on my tongue. When dismissed, the room erupted into a controlled chaos. Chairs scraped, boots shuffled, and the low murmur of voices returned, louder now, some forced laughter, some muttered prayers. I pushed myself up from the bench, my muscles stiff, and moved with the flow of bodies towards the door. The fresh, cold air outside was a relief, cutting through the stifling atmosphere of the hut, but it carried with it the intensified scent of aviation fuel and the damp earth. I made my way back to my BF 109, Red 1. Karl Heinz was waiting, his head bowed, meticulously wiping down the canopy. He offered a small, knowing smile as I approached, his hands, calloused and strong, feeling the cool, smooth plexiglass. "Everything in order, Lieutenant," he said, his voice quiet. "Fuel tanks topped, ammunition belts full, 200 rounds for each MG-17, 60 for each MG FF/M. He patted the fuselage. "She's hungry." The heavy, oily smell of lubricants and gunpowder was strong here, mixing with the ever-present aviation fuel. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The ritual of pre-flight checks was a familiar comfort, a series of practiced movements that grounded me, however briefly, before the unknown. I climbed onto the wing, the rough texture of the walkway against my boots, and then slid into the cramped cockpit. The leather of the seat was cool at first, then quickly warmed by my body heat. The various controls, the stick, the rudder pedals, the throttle, the bewildering array of switches and dials, were familiar friends, cold, smooth metal, and hard plastic under my gloved fingers. The cockpit immediately wrapped around me, a tight, metal embrace. It smelled of stale sweat, hydraulic fluid, a faint whiff of ozone from the electrical systems, and that persistent, metallic tang of my own anxiety. The canopy closed with a soft thud, sealing me into my private world. The outside noises were instantly muffled, the roar of other engines a distant growl, the shouts of the ground crew a faint murmur. It was a strange, isolating silence, punctuated only by the soft hiss of my oxygen mask as I donned it. The rubber felt cool and slightly sticky against my face, and the familiar scent of rubber and my own breath filled the small space. I ran through the pre-start checks, my fingers moving with a practiced, almost automatic rhythm. Fuel pump on, magnetos on, propeller pitch set. "Clear!" I shouted, a muffled sound inside my helmet, and engaged the starter. The Daimler-Benz DB601 engine coughed, sputtered, then caught with a violent roar, shaking the entire aircraft. The vibrations were intense, rattling through the airframe, through my seat, through my very bones. The cockpit filled with the pungent smell of burnt fuel and oil, hot and acrid. The engine's thrum was a deep, guttural growl, filling my head, a powerful, living beast stirring beneath me. I taxied out, following my Staffelkapitän, Hauptmann Vogel, his 109, Red 7, ahead of me. The grass airfield was rough, the landing gear bouncing and jarring, sending vibrations up through the seat. The sky, still a heavy, uniform gray, seemed to press down on us, a vast, indifferent ceiling. The cold air, however, was thinning as we gained altitude, and the chill grew more intense, a penetrating cold that promised to numb the exposed parts of my face once we were higher. Around me, dozens of BF 109s and BF 110s were taking off. Then the heavy, lumbering bombers, Dorniers, Heinkels, Junkers, their engines a deep, resonant chorus of impending violence. The air was a maelstrom of sound and power, the ground crew waving us off, their faces strained, their gestures quick and final. I felt the familiar pull of acceleration as I pushed the throttle forward, the powerful engines surging. The tail lifted, the nose dropped, and the world outside blurred into a rush of green and gray. Then, the sickeningly familiar lift. The ground fell away. The rough vibration of the grass disappeared, replaced by the smooth, steady hum of flight. We were airborne. The earth shrank beneath us, a patchwork quilt of fields and villages, receding into the haze. The air grew colder, thinner, biting at my cheeks where the oxygen mask didn't cover. I adjusted my goggles, the cold glass pressing against my temples. The world was now a vast, empty expanse of gray sky, and the only certainty was the relentless hum of my engine, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, hidden in the clouds, were the Tommies, waiting, and we were flying directly into their embrace. The rubber of the mask felt clammy on my face, and my own breath, hot and stale, was trapped within. I felt the powerful hum of the engine reverberate through the stick, a constant tremor in my hand. The climb was relentless, a slow, straining ascent through the layered gray of the morning sky. The vast formation of the Luftwaffe, hundreds of aircraft, stretched as far as the eye could see, the ponderous, dark shapes of the bombers below us, and the smaller, sharper silhouettes of the other Jaeger squadrons above and around, weaving like anxious protectors. The air grew progressively thinner, colder, biting at every exposed inch of skin. My fingertips, even inside my thick gloves, felt numb, and the exposed parts of my cheeks, not covered by the oxygen mask, were stiff with cold. My Bf-109, a finely tuned instrument of war, vibrated with the constant, powerful thrum of its Daimler-Benz DB601 engine. The sound was a deep, guttural growl that filled the small space of the cockpit, reverberating through my seat, through the stick in my hand, through my very bones. It was a sound that was both comforting in its power and terrifying in its relentless presence. The air inside my oxygen mask was hot and stale, smelling faintly of rubber and my own breath, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the outside world that pressed against the plexiglass canopy. We crossed the French coastline, the familiar patchwork of fields and villages giving way to the vast, shimmering expanse of the English Channel. From 20,000 feet, it looked deceptively calm, a flat, gray sheet stretching to the horizon. But I knew its true nature, cold, deep, and unforgiving, a watery grave for many. My stomach clenched, and the metallic taste of fear intensified, mingling with the ever-present scent of aviation fuel and stale sweat in the cockpit. Hauptmann Vogel, my Staffelkapitän, flew ahead and slightly to the left, his red 7 a constant, reassuring presence. My wingman, Feldwebel Schneider, a quiet, almost scholarly man from Bavaria, kept his red 2 close to my right wingtip, his movements mirroring mine with practiced precision. We were a swarm, 2 pairs of eyes, 2 pairs of guns, bound by a fragile trust. The vastness of the sky emphasized our smallness, our vulnerability. My eyes constantly scanned the horizon, searching, always searching, for the first telltale signs of the Tommies. Tiny specks, contrails, the glint of sun on metal. The strain on my eyes was immense, exacerbated by the cold and the constant glare. My head swiveled, my neck aching, my goggles pressing against my temples. The silence within my helmet, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the engine's roar, felt heavy, pregnant with expectation. Then, a sudden, sharp crackle in my headphones. Static, followed by Major Kessler's voice, distorted but urgent. "Bandits at 11 o'clock. High. Spitfires. Break." The word Spitfires sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Faster, more agile than our 109s in some respects. They were the elite, the defenders. The monster had shown its face. My heart leaped into my throat, hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. Adrenaline surged, sharp and metallic, washing away the creeping dread, replacing it with a burning, focused intensity. My hands, which had been trembling, were now rock steady on the control stick and throttle, every nerve ending alive. My eyes snapped to the 11 o'clock position. There, high above, small, dark specks, glinting in the pale sunlight that was now attempting to break through the cloud cover. They were like angry wasps, descending in a steep, predatory dive. My breath hitched. "Brake right, hard!" Vogel's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the static. I slammed the stick to the right, pushing the rudder pedal, throwing the 109 into a violent, gut-wrenching turn. The G-forces pressed me deep into my seat, pushing the blood from my head, making my vision gray out at the edges. My body felt incredibly heavy, a dead weight against the force of the maneuver. The leather of my seatbelt bit into my shoulders, and the cold metal of the stick felt welded to my gloved hand. The air outside screamed as the wing bit into it. The pungent smell of stale sweat in my oxygen mask intensified. Around me, the orderly formation dissolved into a swirling vortex of aircraft. 109s peeled off in every direction, twisting, turning, diving, climbing. The sky, which had moments before been a vast, empty canvas, was now a deadly dance floor. Tracers, bright ribbons of light, began to streak through the air, their silent, deadly paths carving lines of menace against the gray. The sound of distant machine gun fire, a sharp, metallic hammering, began to filter into my helmet, a chilling counterpoint to my engine's roar. I heard Schneider's panicked voice, a strangled cry, then static, then nothing. My stomach lurched. Was he hit? Was he gone? I couldn't look. I couldn't stop. I had to stay with Vogel. I had to survive. Vogel's red 7 was a blur of movement ahead, climbing steeply now, rolling, trying to gain the advantage. I followed, my eyes glued to his tail, my hands moving with an instinctive speed born of countless hours of training. My 109 shuddered, straining against the G-forces, its engine screaming in protest. The cold air, rushing past the canopy, created an unearthly shriek. A Spitfire, its distinctive elliptical wings a flash of gray, swept past my left wingtip, so close I could almost see the pilot's face. My heart leaped, a wild, frantic thing in my chest. I jerked the stick, trying to bring my guns to bear, but it was too fast. The momentary glimpse of the enemy, so close, so real, was a shock, ripping through the detached veneer of combat. He was not a Tommy, not a bandit. He was a man. I pulled into a tight turn, feeling the incredible G-forces again, the blood rushing to my feet, making my vision swim. My mouth was dry, tasting of metal and adrenaline. The cockpit, once a sanctuary, now felt like a rattling cage, full of noise and vibration, and the imminent threat of destruction. The powerful thrum of the engine, the constant vibration of the stick in my hand, the oppressive cold, all merged into a single, overwhelming sensation of terror and desperate fight. I was no longer Erich Richter, the young lieutenant. I was just a part of the machine, a desperate animal fighting for its life in the vast, unforgiving sky. The world dissolved into a bewildering, terrifying kaleidoscope of speed, noise, and G-forces. The orderly formation was long gone, replaced by a chaotic, swirling melee of Bf-109s and Spitfires. My Red 1 bucked and shuddered, straining against every violent maneuver. The Daimler-Benz engine, a roaring beast beneath my feet, screamed in protest, its thrum now a frantic, desperate pounding that vibrated through the stick and into my very bones. The air outside the cockpit shrieked a constant, high-pitched lament as I threw the aircraft into one impossible turn after another. The cold, thin air at 20,000 feet whipped past the canopy, creating an unearthly howl. My vision, already strained, grayed out at the edges with each tight turn, the blood rushing from my head, making the dials and gauges on the instrument panel swim. The leather of my seatbelt bit mercilessly into my shoulders and thighs, pinning me against the seat. My gloved hands, locked onto the control stick and throttle, were slick with sweat, despite the penetrating cold that still gnawed at my cheeks and fingertips. The stale, rubbery smell of my oxygen mask mingled with the acrid scent of hydraulic fluid and hot metal, a nauseating combination. Tracers, bright streaks of red and yellow, ripped through the air around me. They were like angry hornets, their paths silent but deadly. A sharp, rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed in my helmet, followed by a metallic ping from somewhere behind the cockpit. Instinctively, I slammed the stick forward, pushing the 109 into a desperate, screaming dive. The G-forces reversed, pinning me against my straps, the blood rushing to my head now, making my vision bright with stars. I twisted, craned my neck, trying to see who was on my tail. Nothing, just the vast, empty gray. Then a sudden flash of a Spitfire's distinctive wing. They were relentless. The Spitfire, a graceful but lethal predator, was on me. Its machine guns hammered, a sharp, incessant rattling that filled my helmet, even over the roar of my own engine. The metallic smell of cordite, acrid and biting, seemed to permeate the cockpit, even though the gunfire was outside. Brake right, Richter!" Vogel's voice, distorted by static but unmistakable, ripped through my headphones. He was still with me. He was covering me. A flicker of something akin to hope, fleeting and dangerous, surged through me. I threw the 109 into another violent turn, pushing the stick to its limit, the aircraft protesting with a series of shuddering jerks. My body felt like it was tearing itself apart, the G-forces immense. I could feel the individual fibers of my uniform pressing against my skin. The cold, thin air outside felt like a solid wall I was trying to punch through. A sudden, sharp lurch, a deafening crack that vibrated through the entire airframe. The engine coughed, sputtered, and for a terrifying moment, the powerful roar diminished into a weak, dying whine. My stomach dropped. I was hit. The cockpit filled with the pungent smell of burning oil and glycol, a sickeningly sweet aroma that stole my breath. Smoke, thin and acrid, began to seep from the engine cowling, curling around the instrument panel. My eyes darted to the gauges, oil pressure dropping, engine temperature rising. The throttle felt loose, unresponsive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. My hands, slick with sweat, gripped the stick so tightly my knuckles were white. "Eric, you're trailing smoke. Get out! Get out!" Vogel's voice, now tinged with urgency and despair, crackled in my ear. Get out, eject, bail out. The words, drilled into us since flight school, now felt utterly alien, impossible. Leap into the freezing, empty vastness, hoping the parachute would open, hoping the Tommies wouldn't shoot me as I drifted down, hoping I wouldn't freeze to death in the channel. The cold reality of the option was stark, terrifying. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of the Spitfire, still on my tail, its guns flashing. It was still there. It wanted me. No, not yet. Not like this. A stubborn, defiant fury ignited within me, burning away the fear, replacing it with a cold, desperate resolve. My 109 was wounded, bleeding smoke, but she was still flying. She was still under my control. I wrestled with the stick, pushing the throttle, coaxing the dying engine. The controls felt sluggish, heavy, as if the aircraft itself was resisting. The vibrations were intense, rattling every bone in my body. The cold of the thin air, now threatening to become absolute, seeped through every crevice. I plunged into a steep dive, away from the Spitfire, away from the fight, away from the overwhelming chaos. The ground rushed up to meet me, a vast, dizzying blur of green and brown. The air screamed past the canopy, a deafening roar. The smell of burning oil intensified, stinging my eyes, making them water. My oxygen mask felt suffocating. My head spun, but my focus was absolute. I had to get away. I had to get back, to France, to the airfield, to Karl Heinz, to the promise I'd made myself to see Greta again. The 109 shuddered violently, protestingly. The controls were mushy, unresponsive. The stick felt like a dead weight in my hand. I fought it, every ounce of my strength, every fiber of my being. The cold air rushed past, feeling like an icy hand grasping at the canopy. Through the smoke, through the blurred vision, I saw the shimmering expanse of the channel below, closer now, rushing up at an alarming speed. The gray water looked like a vast, uninviting sheet of steel. It was miles away, but it felt impossibly close. And above me somewhere, the Tommies were still circling, still hunting. The raw, metallic taste of fear, mixed with the acrid smoke, filled my mouth. I was a wounded bird, plummeting, fighting, clinging to life by a thread. And the sky, once my domain, had become a merciless, unforgiving monster. The dive was a controlled fall, a desperate plunge away from the immediate threat. My Messerschmitt Bf 109, Red 1, screamed through the air, trailing a thick plume of black smoke that streamed from its wounded engine, a stark, accusing finger against the gray sky. The smell of burning oil and glycol was now overwhelming, filling the cockpit, acrid and biting, stinging my eyes and catching in my throat. I tore off my oxygen mask, gasping for air, but the cabin air was little better, thick with the stench of scorching metal and my own fear. The rubber of the mask, clammy and hot against my face, felt suffocating. My hands, slick with sweat and shaking with adrenaline, fought the unresponsive controls. The stick felt heavy, sluggish, a dead weight in my grasp, resisting my every command. The rudder pedals, too, were stiff, demanding immense force to move. The entire airframe shuddered violently, protesting its injuries, vibrating through the seat and up into my very skull. The cold, thin air outside howled past the cracked canopy, a constant, mournful shriek. My head pounded, a frantic drumbeat keeping time with the dying engine. Below, the English Channel rushed up to meet me with terrifying speed. It was a vast, cold expanse of gray, choppy water, dotted with whitecaps, looking less like a sea and more like a hungry, waiting maw. I knew the channel, knew its depths, its currents, its unforgiving cold. To ditch in it was a death sentence, almost as certain as being shot down. My mind raced, frantically searching for an alternative. France. Get to France. Any strip of land. My eyes darted to the instrument panel. The oil pressure gauge was practically on zero, the engine temperature gauge buried in the red. The engine itself, once a roaring beast, was now a coughing, sputtering mess, its powerful thrum replaced by a series of increasingly weak, irregular coughs and splutters. Each cough sent a fresh jolt of despair through me. The cold air pouring through the cracked canopy felt like an icy hand grabbing at my throat. I pulled back on the stick, gently, trying to flatten the dive, to convert the plummeting speed into precious altitude, however meager. The 109 responded sluggishly, groaning in protest. The G-forces pressed me back into my seat, the leather biting into my shoulders. I fought the dying machine, urging it, begging it to respond. The smell of burning oil was now so strong it coated the inside of my mouth, a bitter, metallic taste. My throat was raw. Through the haze of smoke and desperation, I spotted it. A distant, dark line on the horizon, barely visible through the swirling smoke and the gray, oppressive sky. The French coast, so far away, so tantalizingly close. My heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm, now seemed to slow, a surge of grim determination replacing the raw panic. "Just hold together, you old bitch," I muttered, my voice hoarse, raw from the smoke and cold. "Just a little longer, for Greta, for Karl-Heinz." I could almost feel the rough, oil-stained hands of my ground crew chief on the fuselage, urging the machine on. The internal monologue was a desperate prayer. The Messerschmitt lurched violently again, a sickening shudder that rattled every bolt in the airframe. The engine coughed once more, a final despairing gasp, and then, with an agonizing clunk, it went silent. The profound, sudden absence of the engine's roar was deafening, a terrifying vacuum in the heart of the cockpit. The only sound was the shriek of the wind rushing past the fuselage and the frantic beating of my own heart. I was gliding now, a heavy, dead weight falling from the sky. The silence was absolute, save for the wind, making every creak and groan of the wounded airframe painfully distinct. The cold was overwhelming, penetrating, instantly numbing my face, my hands, my feet. The plexiglass of the canopy, though cracked, was still my only barrier against the absolute void of the sky. My eyes scanned the horizon, desperately searching for any sign of a suitable landing spot. Fields, roads, anything that wasn't the churning gray of the channel. The controls were now almost entirely unresponsive, the stick mushy, the rudder pedals like lead. I was flying a brick, using what little lift remained, nursing every precious foot of altitude. The smell of burnt oil lingered, a phantom presence. The French coastline grew, slowly, agonizingly, becoming more defined. Cliffs, then a stretch of beach, then fields. But they were all so far, so terribly far. My altitude was dropping rapidly. I could feel the cold, clammy sweat running down my back, despite the freezing air. My gloved hands, still tightly gripping the dead stick, felt like blocks of ice. I spotted a small, uneven field, a patchwork of green and brown, riddled with ditches and potholes, far too small for a proper landing, but it was land. Solid, unyielding earth, my only chance. My mind raced through the emergency landing procedures, drilled into me countless times. Maintain airspeed, prepare for hard landing, cut fuel, open canopy. The last part was crucial. I fumbled for the canopy release, my fingers stiff with cold, clumsy with exhaustion and the lingering shock. The metal release felt cold and unyielding. The ground rushed up now, an overwhelming blur of detail. The texture of the field, the individual trees, the glint of sunlight on a distant roof, all slammed into my vision with terrifying speed. The wind shrieked louder, a rising crescendo of impending impact. I pulled the stick back with every ounce of my remaining strength, trying to bring the nose up, to flare the aircraft, to bleed off what little speed I could. The Messerschmitt stalled, its wings shaking violently, then dropped like a stone. A deafening crash as the belly of the 109 slammed into the hard ground, a violent, bone-jarring impact that threw me forward against my seatbelts, knocking the wind from my lungs. The world spun, a chaotic blur of green, brown, and gray. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, and the distinct, sickening sound of tearing metal filled the air. My head snapped back, hitting the headrest with a dull thud. The sudden deceleration was immense, crushing. The smell of dirt, pulverized earth, and tearing metal filled my nostrils, a potent, visceral assault. My hands, still clenched on the stick, felt jolted, bruised. Then, an abrupt, shocking silence. The screeching, the tearing, the vibrating, all gone, replaced by a ringing in my ears and the soft, almost gentle hiss of escaping air. I was alive. I was down. The cold, rough texture of the crumpled metal surrounding me was real. The smell of damp earth and shattered aircraft was overpowering. I could feel the pain radiating from every joint, every muscle, but I was breathing. I was on land. The monster had not claimed me yet. The silence was absolute, a profound, ringing emptiness that pressed in on me after the terrifying crescendo of the crash. My ears, still ringing, slowly began to register the softer sounds. The gentle hiss of escaping air from a ruptured line, the faint creak of cooling metal as the crumpled fuselage settled, the steady drip, drip, drip of fluid from somewhere beneath the mangled engine. The cockpit was a twisted mess of shattered plexiglass, bent metal, and loose wires. The smell of burnt oil and glycol was still heavy, but now mixed with the pungent, earthy aroma of damp soil and crushed grass. My breath hitched, each inhale a painful rasp in my raw throat. I was alive. That thought, simple and staggering, slowly began to push through the fog of pain and shock. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache, and my body felt like one enormous bruise. The leather of my seatbelt had dug deep into my shoulders and chest, leaving angry red welts. My gloved hands, still clutching the control stick as if it were a lifeline, were numb and trembling. The cold, hard metal of the stick felt alien, heavy. Slowly, carefully, I tried to move. A sharp, searing pain shot through my left ankle. I gritted my teeth, a choked groan escaping my lips. It was twisted, jammed against the rudder pedal, but not, I hoped, broken. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumbled for the canopy release. The mechanism, thankfully, was still mostly intact, and with a grunt of effort, I managed to push the mangled canopy open a few inches. A rush of cold, damp air, fresh and clean, streamed in, chasing away some of the suffocating stench of burnt oil. The metallic taste of fear slowly began to recede from my mouth, replaced by the bitter taste of adrenaline and shock. I pushed myself upwards, slowly, painfully, my muscles screaming in protest. The world outside the cockpit was a chaotic blur of green and brown. My Red 1 lay crumpled in the muddy field, its nose buried deep in the earth, one wing bent at an unnatural angle, the other torn and mangled. The propeller, once a blur of lethal power, was twisted into a grotesque, static spiral. The sleek lines of the Messerschmitt were gone, replaced by a broken, pathetic wreck. The cold, wet mud clung to the shattered fuselage, a stark testament to the violence of the landing. With immense effort, I unbuckled my seatbelt, the heavy leather straps falling away. My body felt incredibly heavy, stiff, and sore. I half climbed, half fell out of the cockpit, my left ankle screaming in protest as my weight landed on it. I collapsed onto the wet, muddy earth beside the wreck, gasping for breath, the cold, damp soil a brutal shock against my cheek. The smell of mud, rich and earthy, mixed with the lingering scent of aviation fuel. The field was wide, desolate, stretching to a distant tree line under the oppressive gray sky. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the tattered remains of my plane, and the distant, almost ghostly rumble of artillery, a constant, low reminder that the war was still very much alive. There was no one, no ground crew, no medics, no friendly faces. Just me, the shattered wreckage, and the vast, indifferent expanse of rural France. The air was frigid, making my teeth chatter, and the cold, wet mud soaked through the thin fabric of my uniform. I pushed myself up, slowly, painfully, onto my right knee, clutching my injured ankle. The pain was a dull, throbbing ache that radiated up my leg. My head spun, and for a moment, the world blurred. I took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air burning in my lungs. My gloved hands, now covered in mud and a thin smear of engine oil, felt rough and stiff. I looked back at my 109, my beautiful, deadly machine, now reduced to a broken shell. A profound weariness settled over me, heavier than any G-force, deeper than any physical pain. It was the weariness of a spirit stretched too thin, of a young man forced to contend with too much death, too much fear, too much destruction. The monster had almost claimed me. It had claimed Schneider. It had claimed countless others. I thought of Greta, her innocent letters, her dreams of my return, of Muti, her stern but loving warnings, of Karl Heinz, his worried eyes. I was alive, but I was alone, miles from home, in a broken machine, surrounded by a world that felt utterly shattered. The cold mud soaked through my boots, chilling my feet to the bone. The wind whipped at my hair, carrying the scent of distant conflict. My gaze drifted to the sky, that vast, indifferent gray expanse that had nearly been my tomb. Above, I could still hear the faint, high-pitched whine of distant aircraft. More 109s perhaps, or Tommies. The battle raged on, unseen, unheard, a relentless, churning maelstrom of metal and fire. My part in it was over, for now. With a grunt of effort, I forced myself to stand, leaning heavily on my good leg, the pain in my ankle a constant companion. I looked around, taking stock of the desolate landscape. A small, indistinct farmhouse in the far distance, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney, a sign of life, a tiny beacon in the overwhelming emptiness. I began to limp, slowly, agonizingly, away from the wreckage, away from the acrid smell of burnt metal and the silent accusation of the broken machine. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a fight against the pain, against the cold, against the crushing weight of exhaustion. The mud squelched under my boots, cold and wet. My breath plumed out in ragged white clouds, each exhale a small cloud of life against the vast, indifferent sky. The Battle of Britain raged overhead, a symphony of destruction I could no longer hear, no longer fight. I was merely a survivor, a small, limping figure in a vast, ruined world, carrying nothing but my exhaustion, my pain, and the overwhelming, persistent memory of the monster that lurked in the sky. My journey was not over. It had merely shifted, from the brutal clarity of aerial combat to the raw, aching struggle of simply putting one foot in front of the other, towards the distant, uncertain promise of safety. The cold wind bit at my face, a final, harsh reminder of the day's brutal encounter, and the taste of mud and defeat was bitter on my tongue.